come to symbolize death. And Schmidt himself notes that they found bone fragments in layers of dirt that filled the complex. And Schmidt thinks that beneath the limestone floors of the complex, he'll find a tomb, a final resting place for a society of hunters. So Schmidt says overall the site may have been a burial ground or the center of a death cult, laid out on the hillside among the stylized gods and spirits of the afterlife. So it's a way for the dead to look out on the hill over a bunch of hunter-gatherers and a beautiful scene of nature. It's sort of a hunter's paradise in that region, or at least it was 10,000 years ago. So if you were to ask Schmidt, he'd probably say that the construction of tombs and the commemoration of the dead is what may have established civilization itself. It required the resources and the willpower of hunter-gatherers to work together, and out of it came the domestication of livestock and the domestication of crops and everything that we have today. So, pretty big theory. Now, one last thing I want to mention in this episode is the origin of burial itself and where it goes back to. This is something that anthropologists have been looking into a lot, and they noted that there have been found Neanderthal burials that go back about 50,000 years. So this is something embedded in the collective memory of humanity very deeply. About a century ago, a Neanderthal skeleton was unearthed in a cave in southwestern France, and according to a new 13-year reanalysis of the site that was released in 2013, which National Geographic noted, the Neanderthal skeleton was intentionally buried. The companions of the Neanderthal took great care to dig him a grave and protect his body from scavengers. The study was released in order to try to settle a long-standing debate about Neanderthals and its remains and what Neanderthal society was like. For the first century after the discovery of Neanderthals, they were typically imagined as non-human creatures, and their primitive aspects and non-human aspects were emphasized. They were thought of as brutes that couldn't even stand up straight and just swung heavy clubs and only grunted. But the pendulum has swung more recently in the other direction, where there's much more of an effort to anthropomorphize them, some say too much, where some scientists argue that the creatures were so close to humans that a Neanderthal could wear a suit and a hat on a subway and go largely unnoticed. And they would have had traditions, perhaps could have spoken, would have had a language. And so anthropologists have argued that sometimes Neanderthals have been anthropomorphized too much, and others have said they've been dehumanized. And here's an example of how this has been misunderstood. A cave in Iraq was discovered in 1960, and excavators studying fossils uncovered evidence of multiple Neanderthal burials. One burial was really interesting because soil samples surrounding the individual revealed pockets of pollen. The leader of the team, Ralph Selecki, viewed this pollen as evidence that the flowers were placed in the grave when the Neanderthal was buried, in a very modern human style, like a bouquet of flowers. So this flower burial suggested that the Neanderthals had an appreciation of beauty. This was the first time a sentiment had been found to extend beyond the boundary of humanity. And he argued that scientists couldn't deny that Neanderthals experienced a full range of human motions. But later it was discovered that the pollen wasn't originally there at the burial site. It was actually transported there by rodents who were burrowing and disturbed the soil in distinctive patterns. So this collapse of the flower burial hypothesis made scientists be more cautious when it came to putting human beliefs and imposing them on Neanderthals, especially when there's limited fossil evidence. But when it comes to looking at Neanderthal sites, most anthropologists now believe, by looking at 20 or so grave sites throughout Western Europe, that Neanderthals buried their dead at least some of the time. The site in France at La Chapelle-aux-Saints has been something of a question mark since it was discovered in 1908 by two brothers who were also archaeologists. They immediately speculated the remains were intentionally buried, but there was a lack of information about the excavation procedures. But new excavations in the early 2000s showed that the depression where the Neanderthal skeleton was found was at least partially modified to create a grave. Moreover, unlike the reindeer and bison bones also found in the cave, the Neanderthal remains contained few cracks and didn't show any signs of weathering-related smoothing or disturbance by animals, so it was intentionally buried under the ground to be protected. So the idea that Neanderthals buried their dead, it fits with findings that suggest they were capable of symbolic thought and of developing rich cultures. Some findings showed that they likely decorated themselves using pigments and wore jewelry made of feathers and colored shells. And the finding from the site also suggests that Neanderthals cared for their sick and elderly. The skeleton discovered by the brothers belonged to a Neanderthal who was missing most of his teeth and showed signs of hip and back problems, meaning that it would have taken assistance to be moved around, and the Neanderthal didn't just abandon their sick like a pack of animals would. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, that's all I have in this episode is this overview of tombs. What are some of the oldest tombs that we know about? I'm not making any groundbreaking pronouncements here, but just that the experience of commemorating the dead is something that goes back very, very far. The fact that we can know with precision somebody who died 5,000 or 6,000 years ago is incredible because there's so little we know with certitude going back that far in history. But the experience of commemorating the dead is something that may have played a critical role in the rise of civilization itself. And it's not something that just comes along later once we figure out how to plow a field or cook an animal or build a simple hut. So I'd like to thank listener Paul Fraser for submitting the question, and you are always free to submit similar questions to me like this. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.